Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Ask an Anthropologist about world building. Uh, Glad to have some people here today. And All right, I guess submit your questions. We don't have any advanced questions in the YouTube chat. I do have two questions that were submitted from Facebook in advance. But I'll give people a second here to kind of, um, uh, see if they have any additional questions. Otherwise, I'll start to jump in. If you don't know who I am, my name is Michael Kilman. I am an applied anthropologist. I have a master's degree in anthropology from Portland State University, where I focused on media systems, which kind of just fed into my whole love of fictional worlds and speculative fiction. In 2021, me and a friend, we published a book called Build Better Worlds, an introduction to anthropology for game designers, fiction writers, and filmmakers, which focused really on getting people the core information they need for world building. Kira Wellstrom's my co-author. She's a brilliant forensic anthropologist. She knows all the icky body stuff like the back of her hand. That stuff is not as much my forte. But writing the book with her taught me a lot about forensics and decomposition and all these kinds of really interesting things. One of these days, I'm going to try to get her on here as well. So it looks like we don't have any particular other questions at the moment. So I'm just going to start out with the Facebook questions. And the first one is, how do you write about cultures that are real but are not your own? Which is a very difficult topic in some cases, um, because people are obviously concerned about things like cultural appropriation or stereotypes or misrepresentation. So it's a really apt and important question. So if I'm going to write about a culture that's not my own, especially a culture that has been historically marginalized, then you really have to do some research. You have to look at the kinds of things that historically have impacted this culture. You're going to be considering how their cultural system works. And there's also something, though, that I think what you'll find in more amateurist kind of world building, and that is that they don't give people agency. For every cultural system, there is complexity. There are always going to be people who deny what the culture is doing. There are going to be people who they reject core tenets of the cultural sphere or system. There will be always people who are skeptical. There are people who will be rebels in the system. And then there's also just individuals, right? We often hold conflicting ideas in our head. So the first thing you need to do is research. The second thing you need to do is consider what we call individual agency. And agency, that term in anthropology means the ability to make choices, but there's a caveat in anthropology, because in anthropology we know that no one is really truly an individual. They are a product of their culture, their history, their language. All of these things are not stuff that you invented, right? This is why it's so interesting, because when you actually think about individuals, what you're thinking about is a very small sliver of identity. And the rest of that stuff is just simply people kind of adopting the cultural norms and values and ideas. So, for example, when you were born, the religion, the education of your parents, the rituals, holidays, all those stuff, the language, all those things are given to you, including a very long arm of history about your culture that you have nothing to do with and interact with. So if you're going to be representing anyone in fiction, you have to be thinking about these things. That individual identity is actually only a very small sliver of the cultural experience of an individual. But at the same time, any individual can deny all that stuff. And, you know, when you become a teenager and you go to college, or you go out into the world, you begin to form kind of your own separate kind of identity. That's a lot of what teenage rebellion is about, for example. It is about looking at the cultural systems you see, looking at your parents and your upbringing, and kind of creating your own identity. So all cultures do this. So no matter what culture you're representing, what culture you're building, that is something that's definitely going to be happening. So those are the two things. First, you're going to consider doing a lot of research. So if you're looking at a marginalized community, you're going to look at the power structures that have been historically marginalizing them. And then next, you're going to consider their individual agency, that they can deny all of this culture research you've done. They can kind of throw any piece of that away. They will naturally want to keep some of it. If nothing, at least their language. But maybe they'll look at history and be like, I don't agree with that, or I want to look deeper into the complexities of this conflict. Or maybe they will side, if they're an oppressed population, there are plenty of oppressed people who also side with the oppressor, because there's advantages in doing that. Sometimes you can get ahead by siding with the colonizer. So there's lots of things to consider there. And last, I always recommend, if you're picking a real culture, try, if you can, to find someone who has specific knowledge about that culture, either as a researcher, or even better, if you can't do that, if you can do better, you would want to pick someone who actually grew up in the culture. So that's something to consider when you're writing about real cultures that aren't your own. And I also just think, like, if you're going to write another culture more generally, let's say you are building a fictional world and it is located in this particular other culture. First, you should question if you're the right person to write that book, first of all. Like, is it really necessary for you to write that individual culture? It might make sense for you to do it. It might not make sense for you to do it, because there might be someone with a real lived experience that does that. But also, like, I don't believe that you should just not write another culture. You shouldn't just skip something over simply because it's difficult or hard. Good writing, good world building in general is confronting the complexity of the world, right? But there are certain situations where you may not want to be representing another culture. So be thinking about that too. But yeah, if you can find someone who really represents that culture and has gone through it, and have them read your narrative and give you feedback and be like, hey, is this accurate? That can be super helpful. Yeah, so make sure that you're doing your due diligence. It's like any other kind of research. If you're going to write about Victorian England, you're going to sit down and you're going to study a lot of stuff about Victorian England. And you're not just going to study the people and the political conflicts, you're going to study the archaeology of that era. What kind of items did they have? What was common use, right? You're also going to be looking at, like, what are the norms of economics? Like, what does it look like to be at the top of the situation in Victorian England? What about the middle? What about the bottom? You want to make sure you have a well-rounded kind of holistic experience of what the world is going to look like. So it's the same thing when you're doing another culture. You gotta make sure that what you're doing is saying, I'm looking at all aspects here, because again, anyone can deny this stuff. Okay, well, yes, absolutely, free to come in and out as you choose. Free to feel any questions. I'm happy to field to the best of my ability. If I don't have an answer for you, I will find one and put it in the chat. Don't know everything, but I can certainly try to answer, or at least speculate along with all of you. I have a second Facebook question here, and that is, how do you create a really interesting and unique mythological system that's realistic? And I think one thing I would recommend is looking up the anthropologist Mary Douglas. There's a bunch of videos online that you can find, and I will put one in the chat after, that just talks about her core concepts. Mary Douglas's whole project in the late 1960s was to look at how do cultures construct concepts of purity. And what that has to do with mythology is that mythology is fundamentally about the values of a society. It is marking what is clean, what is dirty. And when I say clean and dirty, I don't just mean like I put my shoe on the table on the dinner plate next to my shoe. What I also mean is that I'm looking at what does it mean to be a good and a bad person in that society? What values does that society have? And mythological stories are going to be covering the kinds of values that the culture and society has. So, and as I mentioned last time, when you're thinking about maps, for example, in the last live stream we talked about this, you're going to be thinking about geography. You're going to be thinking about access to resources. Certainly a desert mythology is going to have a concept where they're going to conserve water. Very often desert cultures it's very important to share resources because resources are scarce. Not always the case. But often you're going to think about the kind of clothing and covering. So, there's a lot of misconceptions, for example, that the hijab and various other, and the niqab and various other coverings in the Muslim world have originated with Islam or they're enforced by Islam, but in reality, those were the style of dress that existed long before Islam came along. For thousands of years, people have been dressing in those. And it's simply practical at the onset, right? You don't want to go near naked into the desert. That's a terrible idea. What you're going to do is you're going to wear some kind of clothing that is going to conserve your sweat. It's going to be long, it's going to be flowing, but it's also going to trap moisture in to keep yourself cool throughout the hot day, right? So your mythology is naturally going to surround certain kinds of garments. There's going to be certain kinds of foods. And back to Mary Douglas again here. Mary Douglas was asking again these questions of purity, and she looks in particular at the Hindu Vedas in her book. And she also looks at the book of Leviticus. And the reason she looks at this is because she wants to understand how do you get things like food or clothing or marital taboos or various other things, right? Some of those things have to do with power, but another one of those things has to do with things like schismogenesis. And if you don't know what that schismogenesis is, it's the concept of identity through opposition. In other words, I am going to make my identity specifically in opposition to you. So if you are, for example, oppressed by the Babylonian Empire, as ancient Jews were at some point in their history, and you notice that they have a staple, and that staple in their food diet is pork, you might think to yourself, I don't want to eat the food of the oppressor. And so their myth structure then references that, right? Hence the beginning of the pork taboo. Now, there can be other reasons beyond that for the pork taboo. Perhaps some of them notice that if you didn't cook it a certain way or cook it long enough, you might get sick. It could be the fact that very often pigs, not in the wild, but when they're domesticated, become quite disgusting and filthy creatures. That is the product of a human domesticated environment, not necessarily in the wild. And pigs are omnivores. They will eat whatever you give them. So there could be multiple reasons, but it will be represented in your mythological structure. So you're going to be thinking about concepts of purity all throughout your mythological structure. When you build it, you're going to be thinking about what are the key values. And again, their geography is going to play a role in the mythological structure. Like I said with the desert reference, if you go to the Arctic, for example, they're going to have lots of mythological structures around the cold. And also a part of that myth structure will be kinds of monsters. The mighty Wendigo, for example. The mighty Wendigo is a great example of a mythological creature that is in the Arctic Circle area. The Inuit and other native Alaskan tribes, for example, have this Wendigo, this terrible creature that results from the consumption of human flesh. You're said to turn to a Wendigo if you are alone and isolated in the wilderness and you're starving to death. And you turn and just get desperate and eat human flesh, which tells you something about their taboo, right? Their taboo in their mythological structure is don't eat human flesh, no matter how bad it gets. If you eat human flesh, you're going to turn into a monster, right? So that tells you something about their concepts of purity. So, other questions? Happy to field questions. Looks like I got several viewers here now. But more than happy to field more. I can talk all day about anthropology and world building, you guys, and I will talk for at least an hour here in total. But if you have lots of good questions, I may stay even a little bit longer. Let's see, what else? Health, I think, is another really interesting one, or concepts of a body. Something that we don't often think of, for example, is that surgery is not intuitive. The idea for most of human history that when you are sick, you cut into somebody to make them better is very counterintuitive. You're like, I am going to put a hole in somebody to heal them. Even if it's like appendicitis or they've got some sort of stomach ache, you might not think that surgery is necessarily the right way to go. And so you'll have all kinds of systems develop around that. It took many hundreds of years of experimentation to get to surgery, and took many hundreds of years of dissecting bodies and medicine and all kinds of strategies and approaches. And really, our collective knowledge of Western medicine, at least, is only 100 to 200-ish years old. If you were to go back to the American Civil War time, most of you know more about treating wounds and medicine than the average doctor during that Civil War period, right? So if you're building a fictional world, you're going to be thinking about what kind of medicine, what are the concepts of the body? Not every culture has the same concepts. If you look at miasma theory is another great example. Before we have the Western concept of germ theory, we have miasma theory, which is the idea that bad smelling air is what makes you sick, right? And it kind of makes sense if you think about it. If you know nothing about germs, you don't have the technology or tools to see tiny little microscopic organisms, then you notice that when there's foul smelling air around, like flatulence, for example, that's a sign of sickness, or rotting bodies, that you can get sick from being around rotting bodies. Actually, it's actually a smart way to go, because you don't understand the science of it, you don't have the technology for it, so you say, well, what's the closest association? So you build a whole structure around that. All right, I got a question here. For my game, there is a dream world that allows you to reach other dreams. I'm using this dream world as a vehicle to levels. How do I go about giving that dream world character? So one thing you're going to be thinking about is, what is the everyday reality and the lived experience of humans in that culture, first of all. What is the dream world? The dream world is going to reflect, albeit abstractly, the regular world. You don't dream about stuff you don't know about. You may find yourself interested in looking in the concept of Aboriginal Dreamtime, for example, the concept of the everywhen. That's a really interesting concept to see a different way of approaching dreaming. I wouldn't necessarily just copy and paste the Aboriginal approach to Dreamtime, but I would also look very heavily about that. If you want a fiction novel that's relatively short, that actually is where James Cameron Avatar really truly comes from, The Word for World is Forest by Ursula K. Le Guin. It's a pretty short read. I think it's like 180 pages. But they use this kind of concept of dreaming and accessing dreams. I'm not sure if that quite answers your question. So it sounds like you're building this game and the people are leveling up in these dreams. Using these dreams or this dream space You can consider, what do you want your characters to achieve in a particular dream? Are they achieving lucidity so that they can take control of their dreams? Are they in a river or a tide of experience that makes it impossible for them? What's the purpose of this? Do they tread in the realm between dream and nightmare? How would you want to be kind of thinking about those particular things? And again, back to like concepts of purity. What is considered terrifying in this particular dream? What in the waking world are they struggling with, right? And how would that reflect nightmares? A very interesting question. If I didn't quite get to your point, add a clarifying comment, and I will circle back around to it. We got another question here. When writing about the world's values or mythos, how much is too much elaboration? When should we let the audience imply the makeup of the world versus when should we explain it as an author? Yeah, this question came up last time too, because it's such an important question. How much to put in the myth structure? Certainly the way they dress, the way they build their structures. You can have kind of a tour guide sort of explaining the world to a person. If the person is an outsider or a traveler, that's real easy to do, to say, welcome to my culture, here's what you need to know. You can even do this through a conflict. You could explain the mythology through a conflict by doing things like, this person comes into the town and they make a social faux pas, something that is forbidden in the culture and society, and maybe they end up in prison, or maybe they end up in like a fight or a conflict and they don't understand why. And in the aftermath, what you would see is some sort of explanation via dialogue and action at why this is offensive. And actually, in some cases, it's fun to not tell right away. A character comes into the culture and they get into this conflict because, I don't know, maybe they shake with their left hand in their culture, and in their culture, and a number of human cultures, before there was toilet paper, before there were bidets, I know this is gross, but people would wipe their butt with their left hands. And so offering your left hand could be extremely offensive. Shoes in many cultures are very offensive. There's a lot of cultures out there, several dozen cultures, that if you throw a shoe at someone, it's like giving them the middle finger. So there's a lot of opportunity there to say, oh, this person ended up in jail and maybe they're there for weeks, and maybe what they do is they talk to a prisoner and slowly get to know pieces of the culture over time. And then finally, when they go to the court, that you have violated such and such a law. But it's a really interesting way of building tension, and also, helping the reader kind of out, because again, as I've said in the last live stream, you don't want to overwhelm people. You want to give them pieces. You want to, like a real person growing up in a culture, you want to give them a little bits by little bits by little bits. So how much is too much? I would think what you can get a good idea. Beta readers are really helpful in this case, especially if you're talking about writing. If you're talking about a visual setting, there's so much you can do with mythology just by, like in film. Film has so many advantages in the visual medium. And this is why you so often see books don't translate well to film, and people get really uppity about their like how didn't match what was in their head and various other things, right? But like, so film has an advantage because you can show a whole bunch of mythological structures, be it religious icons, architecture, clothing, all this stuff that would imply mythological stuff. When writing, you're going to be describing little bits. You might be, through dialogue, someone adjusts their shirt or their clothes, or maybe they won't refuse to take off their hats, even though in your culture it's a respectful thing. So you're going to be thinking about unique and creative ways of conflict, really, or misunderstandings. Even in a culture where you have a situation, and I mentioned this last time, sorry guys, I don't mean to plug my own stuff here, but just as an easy, quick example, for my book, Mimi of the Nowhere, what you'll see is that there's a lot of people who have questions very quickly about, well, why does the world work this way? What the hell is a biorecycler? Why does it smell bad? One character is a telepath, but she thinks she's the only telepath in the whole wide world. And halfway through the novel, she descends upon, or discovers, or rather, they find her. An order of telepaths that have a very long history, and so as they're training her, she gets an explanation of some of the history of telepathy. So that's kind of a way of approaching this myth structure. It's really just thinking about how do you keep from doing too much info dumping in one setting. And I don't know if there's a set number. Different genres have different levels of patience with info dumping. Historical fiction, fantasy, and sci-fi can get away with quite a bit more info dumping if done strategically. I usually recommend a situation if you're doing a really complex world, what they call in media res. So in the middle of conflict, you're dropping a character, there's a middle of a conflict somewhere, or pretty quickly there will be conflict, and then having them work their way out, getting the reader invested. And once the reader is invested, they're much more curious about the world. And then just each chapter, or every so often, you're dropping more information for the reader to digest. I think that's the way to go. Hi Shay, hi Vince, good to see you. I didn't realize that was you, Vince. Xenopug, I guess, huh? But always good to see friends here on the live stream. Vince is building this really incredible game, you guys. I thought maybe that was him with the dream question. It's like a tower defense game. I am super excited to play it. Definitely let us all know, Vince, when your game is ready for beta testing, because I would totally be a beta tester. Yeah. Great question. What else you guys got here tonight? We got plenty of time left to field some questions. And again, I can talk about this stuff all day long. One subject that I think doesn't get talked a lot about in world building more generally is archaeology. And I have an archaeology video here, Anthropology in 10 or less. It's just an intro to archaeology. It'll give you a real quick spiel, 10 minutes, about what archaeology is and how we do it. But just in general, archaeology is about the stuff that cultures make. Some of that stuff is adaptive. And one way to think about culture is that a lot of what culture does is adapting to a physical or social environment, right? So if you're in the Arctic, your archaeology is naturally going to have a lot of thick, warm clothing. You're going to have tools and techniques to survive that climate. If you are in the jungle, clothes are going to be less of a concern. A little bit of a side note here. Tom's Shoes is a great example of this. If you don't know what Tom's Shoes is, it was like this. I actually interviewed the guy when I was doing journalism back in I think 2008, 2009, and he was heralded as this genius. And Tom's Shoes had this 1-for-1 model. If you buy our shoes, we'll give a free pair to some needy person at some part of the world. Well, it looked great. He was heralded in Forbes magazine and The Economist and all. This is this brilliant model. This will replace nonprofits and this will change and radically alter the world. Well, what he didn't understand was that there's a lot of cultures that don't wear shoes. Because if you wear shoes in a very humid jungle environment and you have no way of changing out things like socks because they're not given socks, then you get things like trench foot. And people got gangrene. And some people lost their feet. And then some people realize very quickly that shoes are not very useful in those kinds of environments. And so there's these piles you can actually Google and find of Tom's shoes in large landfills. And then on top of that, like giving a whole bunch of free shoes to a third world country also creates a problem with cobblers. If people are making a living off shoes and suddenly there's an influx of free shoes, you're disenfranchising people. And so when you're thinking archaeologically speaking, you might be thinking about what kind of things won't be necessary as well. What won't they need going forward? And then also too, like just because some new cultural ideas come to town doesn't mean a culture wants to adopt them. If you're talking about a long-term contact situation where you're talking about two cultures in contact for 100 years, if there's a power dynamic, you're going to have some people who are going to adopt and assimilate to that culture and the cultural material, and they'll take on much of the identity, and they'll take on the objects. And on the other hand, you'll have people who resist it. They don't want these new objects or ideas. They'll try to stick to the old ways. You'll also see generationally, younger generations are always much more likely to adopt new things than older generations. And that's just people like the familiar. If you grew up, at a certain era, you're going to have preferences for things in that era. I mean, I could talk more on archaeology if you guys want. If you're not familiar, a really great case study of archaeology and thinking about what cultures have is Otzi the Iceman. Look up Otzi the Iceman. It's spelled O-T-Z-I. He was a guy found in a glacier, and he is just fascinating because at first they didn't even kind of know what killed him because he was all filled with disease. I think he had a knife wound or an axe wound in the back. But he might have also died of starvation. They could actually open his stomach up and see what he had been eating culturally. And then, of course, there's all those objects and everything. It's a really fascinating case study. There's also quite a few bog bodies out there that have a lot of cultural material, mummies that have a lot of cultural material, lots of really great stuff, and grave goods. If you want to study ancient cultures and incorporate some kind of archaeology into your world, those are great places to start, is to be thinking about those things. And no matter what you're doing with your fictional world, there's probably a history. And if there's not a history, that's a whole world built in of itself, right? And what I mean by that is if, let's say, you have a bunch of humans, like in the series The Expanse, they land on the planet, is it Illis? I think it's Illis. And there's never been any humans, but also they find all kinds of ancient alien ruins that they're trying to figure out what the hell they are. So that's an interesting, what is the history of the alien species, which is always an interesting question when you stumble upon alien ruins. But there could be cultures that you're dreaming up that land on a planet, or maybe they accidentally find themselves in a parallel reality, and there is no human culture and there's no one around. And so then you have a question of, how do you build a culture from scratch? Especially if you have a group of people. If you have one or two people, then unnaturally they'll take their culture with them. I think what's really interesting is when you get a group of diverse people who get stranded in a situation and suddenly they're having to figure out how to speak together and communicate and work together to find common ground. In those cases, what we get is something called like a pidgin language. And a pidgin language is a language where you have a group of people who, for at least a temporary period initially, are suddenly forced in a situation where they can't communicate. They all speak different languages. And so what you see over the course of weeks or months is that they begin to share words. And the words from their own languages mix together. They'll pick different words, depending on what they're doing. Maybe someone's an expert at fishing, so everyone learns all the fishing terms from the fishing expert person, and they're learning, oh, what's this net, or what is this, what is this spear, or what is this fishing basket? There are fishing basket cultures. And then maybe you have someone who knows something about engineering, and they're trying to build pulleys and levers and ropes and all kinds of things. And so you would get some of that language integration in there. And then you have a hunter who maybe knows how to do some fletching and build a bow and arrow. And so you'd get those concepts. And then someone who is picking up berries, and all the words and languages from there, that gets mixed in. So people will take their specialties and they'll begin to blend that language. And that's a pidgin language. And you see this in cases where you get lots of immigrants together who from different cultures who are suddenly in a temporary work situation where they have to work for a year or more. And then you get a Creole language after that. And a Creole language is when a pidgin language becomes passed on to the next generation. So say this group of people, they're stranded and they start having kids together. Because they don't know how, they're never going to escape, so they start having families and they start building a whole culture. The language that they pass on, that pidgin language that's mixed, is now a Creole. And Creole is not just a language of the Caribbean and places like Louisiana. Creole is a category of languages as well. You may have also heard of Pidgin before in Hawaii, and Pidgin language is kind of like, it's kind of becoming more of a Creole language because it's now being passed on to next generations. But a Pidgin language is a temporarily created language, and a Creole language is a language that was temporarily created, but then becomes a more permanent passed on. Actually, English is an example of what was probably a pidgin language at first, but then became a Creole language over and over again, actually. Because the story of English, and if you are curious about this, there's a book by John McWhorter, who's a linguist called Our Magnificent Bastard Language English. And he talks about the history of this. English is a mix between Germanic language, the language which was the Saxon and the Angles. There's a mix of Norse language in there. There's also a sizable bit of Celtish language. The Celts language are the only culture besides English has what we call the meaningless do principle. No other language that I recall has that besides English and Celt. That's, do you want to go to the park? Do you want some ice cream? All of those kinds of things. Starting that phrase with do only existed, at least historically, in Celtish and English. Other languages don't have that, which is why McWhorter, I think, pretty successfully argues that Celtic language is more influential than people previously realized, right? So you had this situation, and then French, of course, after the Norman invasion in 1066, right? So English is a great example of a blended language that changes over time. So, other questions? I'll yak on all day, guys. That's why they paid me the big bucks as an adjunct professor for so many years, because I can talk. And I love this. I love these topics. What kind of projects are you all working on? Is there anything in particular that you're struggling with um, as a world builder? It's hard. I know myself. I am working on the fifth book of my Chronicles of the Great Migration series, and I'm trying to build a unique political system that takes much of the influences from our current time. It projects them thousands of years, about 1,300 years in the future, but integrates AI, a very empathetic AI, and it's it was designed specifically to be a machine that cares, and it helps manage the civilization. And so, what would that kind of look like? What kind of political structures would exist? And you have a number of different cultures who are forced underground. This is a world with giant walking cities, but it turns out they find out you get hints of it earlier that there was a whole civilization of refugees who couldn't get on the walking cities, who went underground into cave systems and then began building a civilization under there. But it's all these different cultures. It's people from across the political spectrum who are suddenly find themselves needing to survive and work together, and they don't all agree. And so, how do you have a situation where you have a very clear carrying capacity in an underground region? You have a super advanced AI system. There's also some mycology that kind of goes on that they integrate. There is knowledge of Western cultures, there's indigenous knowledge. So, it can be really tough and tricky, and sometimes it can take a long time to kind of figure out how to approach a particular kind of world building mode. What is your political system like? And I think one of the most important things you should be thinking about is, how do I make my culture make sense? How does it become holistic? How does the political system and the economic system and maybe the magic system, how does that all work together? And for all the interesting ways, despite the controversy with Harry Potter, that J.K. Rowling did, she has just, much of her world building is quite flawed. The economic system does not make any sense whatsoever. There's no clear conversion rates here. There's no reason why something should cost a certain amount and something shouldn't cost another amount. The whole galleon system is it's very strange. It's very clear. The whole economic systeming of the wizarding world is interesting because if you have a magic system and you're able to do most of your stuff through talented magic, how much money do you need to be even making? Why does fiat currency even exist in a Harry Potter world? Certainly there's some way of marking debts that might be magical that could have been really interesting that I think she just really did not even fully consider. It was kind of like I'm going to take this wizarding world and I'm just going to kind of plop on some Western kind of notions of thinking here. And while many of these wizards are members of Western culture, it is important to remember in that particular world that you have the Muggles, and then you have the sorcery. And so I actually think that she does some really interesting stuff. There's a lot of archaeology in the Harry Potter universe, but I think there's some pretty significant places where she falls short. And the political system also. Like, why do they just have a prime minister the same as the English model? Is it because they're inherently English? Did they ever have kings or queens of magic, of the magical world? Like, what was that all about in their history? There's just so many missed opportunities in that fictional world. And you'll see this actually. It's one of the most common critiques I have of a lot of fictional worlds. Economics are largely just kind of like, we're just going to slap something together. The Bethesda stuff, they're really brutal about their economic system, like bottle caps. Like, why would you have fiat currency in that situation? If you are curious about alternative economic systems pre-fiat currency, you might consider David Graeber's book, or at least maybe a YouTube summary of it, because it is quite a dense and academic book, Debt, the Last 5,000 Years. Because before there's fiat currency, we have virtual credit systems. So, small scale communities, everyone kind of knew. Even in cities, silver and things were not widely circulated for a very long time. And it's not a barter system. It's not I trade. The barter systems have never existed. They've never been a mainstay of political things. Barter was usually for enemies or strangers only. Within cultural systems, people often took care of each other. Even in European villages, all throughout the Middle Ages, people mostly just took care of each other and did each other favors. And I owe you a favor. It's a virtual credit system, and you remember. And if people don't pay into the virtual credit system, if someone is always taking but never giving, then they become a pariah in society, and people pull them aside. And I think there's a lot of flaws in world building with economic systems. A lot of people just cannot get over the idea that money is not natural or inherent. It is created by human systems. And how that creation happens varies in different cultures and history. But money and fiat currency don't really become a regular mainstay for the average individual until you get toward the Industrial Revolution. And so really money has only been in wide circulation. Well, and it's even really before the Industrial Revolution, colonialism is what made Europe freely circulate money. Because before then, money was really, it was hard to come by silver pieces. It was hard to come by gold. Like, that's why so many of the conquistadors, they just go gaga for gold and then silver after that, because you can then mass produce coinage, and that was not really possible really before colonialism, and the colonialism is really what ends. It takes a long time, but it's really what ends feudalism and gives rise to the Industrial Revolution and what we consider modern capitalism. So I think there's a lot of people, when they're doing their world building, they just kind of slapdash that capitalistic Industrial Revolution kind of stuff on there. And like, you can do whatever you want with your fictional world. You don't have to follow any standard rules or practices. You can try whatever you want, but you want it to make sense together. And I just, again, my big critique before we get into all the J.K. Rowling is not a great person kind of stuff. And there are some other problems with Harry Potter, like very heavy colonialist kind of thinking in there, which is clear in Rowling's personality and what she did with Native Americans when she started creating like American magic and stuff. But ultimately, like, her economic system makes no sense, given that you have what is essentially a nearly scarcity-free society. It should have been more like Star Trek. Magic is like replicators. If you have magic in that kind of system, you should have this sense of scarcity and the stark differences between wealth and poverty. You can still have those, but it shouldn't be around money. Maybe it should have been around old magic, or family dynasties, which they kind of sort of have with the whole house elf system. But I think what she does is it's just bad world building. Ultimately, I could pick apart that stuff. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'll just keep talking about world building stuff. I think a really great example of world building that I think most people, if you want to take a page from it, is the Expanse universe. But that does a really truly excellent job of world building. It's clear that they really considered the implications of what would happen if you colonized the solar system but did not change capitalism or tech bros or various other things, and what kind of systems would persist, what things would get worse, what things would get better, what kind of technologies would you need to develop if you were colonizing space and you didn't have like shields and gravity, artificial gravity, and life support was limited, and you had to grow much of your food in space, or you had to mine for water across the asteroid belt and other places. There's a lot of really good consideration. It is hard science fiction, so I think they really sat down and thought about the implications, which is, I think, pretty cool. I'm also just biased because I love both the books and the show. I think it's one of those rare instances when they inform each other, that actually reading and watching together enhances the story. Plus, you only get the last three books, the last three elements of the story in the book world. They stop at the end of book 6 in the show. And they do that for a variety of reasons, such as like there's a 30-year time jump, and also I guess the show is really expensive. So um, other great examples of world building. Um, I like Dune, but I do think that in some ways that I think in the films, or in the most recent edition of the films, the Fremen have more agency, individual ability to to take on their own identity, whereas Frank Herbert kind of made all the Fremen sort of two-dimensional. I mean, you get a couple of characters who are not two-dimensional, but overwhelmingly they're kind of just religious zealots. And I think there are some kind of elements that are problematic with that. Um, Certainly, I mean, Herbert is kind of like him and Tolkien are like the godfathers of world building, right? So you have Tolkien and fantasy, and I think Herbert was really trying to do a Tolkien for sci-fi. Um, I mean, he's really the first one to really do it. If you look at the progenitors of sci-fi, like Isaac Asimov, really not that great of a world builder. Arthur C. Clarke, not that great of. They tell a hell of a story, but not great world builders. So, I think it's not really until you get to the 1960s, and also I think that relates to anthropology. We were guys, we were assholes in the early days of anthropology. We painted cultures as stereotypes. Anthropology was originally founded for colonial oppression. It's obviously not that anymore. It tries very hard to really represent the authentic lived experience of humans. But I think the quality of anthropology and social science did impact the quality of world building. Certainly, you had Tolkien, but if you look at what Tolkien is doing, it's largely just a reflection of Europe. Tolkien has some significant problems too. Orcs are two dimensional. Orcs, I know there's arguments against this, but generally speaking, orcs don't have a culture. They have all this blacksmithing technology, which I know is given to them, but also to be able to even do that stuff, to be able to become a skilled artisan, to be able to forge blades requires a certain degree of artistry and knowledge. They certainly have artistic style with the way they do their armor. They certainly have artistic style with the way they do that, but the orcs are not actually culturally relevant. And I actually said this. I was giving a talk at a Denver Nerd Night at one point, which is kind of just like a fun event where you get up and talk about nerdy science subjects. And one of those nights, I gave this lecture on Tolkien's problems with world building and orcs, and just really more generally, like building fictional worlds. And there happened to be a Tolkien scholar in the audience, and he came up to me after. He said, Tolkien actually struggled with the orcs. And one of the reasons he took so long, I guess, to get the Lord of the Rings out, he said, was that he thought the orcs needed more to them, but he really didn't figure out how to do it while at the same time, he was like, they shouldn't have been wholly evil like they were. But he said, ironically, Tolkien had the solution in front of him, that they were essentially possessed by dark magic. But man, what would the Lord of Rings been if you would have had another story about an orc who broke free from this kind of magical oppression, right? How much more interesting would that world have been? I mean, not that the Lord of the Rings is not a masterpiece, it is, but he had his problems in world building. Very few people do world building perfect. It's hard. So I think the most important thing, of course, and I say this all the time, is you got to serve your story. Any final questions on fictional world building? We definitely had some great questions. I will continue to do these. I may also do sessions where we talk about other topics in anthropology besides world building if people are interested in that. I'm kind of just like, what do people want to know about anthropology or world building? I also do sometimes teach classes on fiction more generally, in writing as well. so I'm happy to kind of do all kinds of live streams. Oh, okay. Here we got a question. If you were to make a dark fantasy setting, lore, and atmosphere, how would you go about it? If you were to make a dark fantasy setting, lore, and atmosphere, how would you go about that? So I'm writing a dark fantasy horror novel series called Shades and Shapes in the Dark. The first book came out last May, and it is set beginning in the 1990s. And then it follows the character through 40 years of her life. Each of the four books is basically a decade of her life. Or represents at least a decade of her life. With the first book is when she's 9. The second book, teenager. The third book, 20s and early 30s. The last book, 30s and 40s. But essentially, what I was setting was I was thinking about. Now, this is more akin to dark urban fantasy, so you would approach it differently. But thinking about atmosphere too. As a writer, or as a gamer, a game designer, or a filmmaker, you're going to be even managing how you talk and describe about the world in terms of words and language and symbols, right? If you're writing something darker, then many of your narratives, not just narratives, many of your metaphors should represent that kind of gloominess or that darkness or that fear, and maybe only glimpses of lighthearted stuff here and there. I do think you can overwhelm your reader and make stuff too dark, even if your readers love dark stuff. So I think it's important when you're building a fictional world to kind of put some lightness and connection and love and hope, because like if it's too dismal, people will be like, Jesus, this is depressing. In fact, in my beta read of the first novel, I got that and I was like, okay, I'm going to add a few more hopeful scenes to this novel, and then build in some interesting things in the ways that maybe give not only the readers but the character hope. But I'd be thinking about staging that atmosphere. So in this series, there's like this terrible shape shifting shadow that kills people who are close to her. And she can't get rid of it. In the first book, she doesn't really know what's going on, and then as the series goes on, she's kind of discovering things. In this case, I'm drawing on some real occult knowledge and lore. Really, I'm just drawing on some kinds of concepts from ancient mythology, like Sumerian and Babylonian myth. I'm not leaning too heavy on that stuff. I'm kind of borrowing a few things here and there. I'm referencing monsters because for me, a lot of what she's trying to do as I'm writing book 2 is trying to figure out exactly what this monster is, because she can't find it anywhere. Anywhere she's looking in all these texts and she's reading these books, and she's trying to uncover the stuff. So I'm mentioning all these other kinds of lore, and then in the meantime, I also introduce this new kind of lore and world building into it, where there was this kind of powerful person who had some relationship with this terrible monster, and she's trying to discover what. And so through that, she's reading fragments of, people have found fragments of this person's journal, but they're all in like poetry and riddles and all kinds of stuff. And so you're getting little pieces, sometimes in the epigraphs of chapters, and sometimes she's discussing those epigraphs with other characters and really trying to work her way through. So I think what you're going to do, and now let's say if you're taking like maybe a dark fantasy setting in general, again, if it's dark, what you want is, you want the clothing to reflect that, the archaeological material to reflect struggle and strife. Like if it is dark fantasy, this is a harsh world. You know who is a master of this? If you just want to read an example, Joe Abercrombie. He is just incredible at building like this very dark, it's grim dark for a reason. You have to really like his kind of stuff. It is relentless. No one in that world is a good character. Everybody is super complicated. Everybody's kind of a rascal. They've always got kind of their own agenda. Even in the, some of the characters who set out to have good intentions, boy, do they just get beaten down with the grim nature of that world. So I would maybe take a Joe Abercrombie book, read it and thinking about your own stuff, study some other dark fiction. I've heard Mazalan's Worlds. That series is really good as well. I have the first book. I haven't had the chance to dig into it yet. Let's see. I mean, any kind of grim dark I would set up here, but really think about, dark fantasy is going to have, high rates of it's going to be a harsh environment. So what makes that harsh, right? That's probably maybe the question you really need answered. What makes it harsh? Is it because the food doesn't grow right because the sun is blotted out, and so they're always on the edge of starvation? Is it magic is really oppressive? I have kind of early chapters of a novel. I have no idea if I'll finish it, but the magic system is essentially it kills you. It ages you super fast when you use magic, and so people essentially have what they call life slaves, where they will use another person to channel magic through and suck all their life through. Now, this practice is illegal, and there are people who kind of set out into the world to try and enforce the law, but it's like it's like cartels almost, right? You can't really stop it completely. You can't stop this system completely. So be thinking about what makes it dark, and then just build all around that. The political system should reflect what makes that dark. If it's dreary, maybe it's authoritarian because people are terrified. You don't get democracy in situations where people have extreme scarcity or perceived scarcity. Inequality tends to reflect a lot of anger, a lot of maybe there's a disease, various other things. So yeah, that was a really interesting question to ask for sure. I'm gonna say, any final questions? Any last question here before I sign off tonight? Hopefully I answered all of your questions well. If I didn't, I am more than happy to add a little follow-up here. And I appreciate you all coming out tonight and asking your questions about world building. This is as much fun for me as it is hopefully informative for you. If you don't know, I have a ton of free resources on my website, liridianslaboratory.com. If you're curious about maybe a dark fantasy piece, I have a free short story on there called Eye of the Wood that you can check out for totally free. There's an audio version and an ebook version available. It's pretty short. It's 30-minute audiobook, 6,000 word story, so pretty quick and easy read. But I have a whole page, writing and writing advice. That page has recordings from panel discussions with me and other people on world building, on mythology, on religion, that are totally free for you to listen to and download. I have written a number of essays on world building. Some of them are pretty brief and short. Others go into greater depth. There's the Build Better Worlds. The monsters chapter is up in that section. So you actually get a sample chapter from Build Better Worlds. Maybe you'll find that useful if you're doing horror. So yeah, there's just a ton of free resources. I'm always putting more stuff out. If you really like my stuff, come to my Substack. It's Liridian at Liridian's Lab is my Substack. If you just search for Michael Kilman Substack, I'm sure I'll pop right up. And I'll always be posting stuff there. I'm currently working on a course. It's taking a bit of time called World Building Through Dialogue. And it is really, how do you use dialogue as a tool for world building? That will be an e-learning course that you can take. It's going to be totally free. You'll be able to it'll basically be, you subscribe to my Substack and it'll be up on my Substack with a password. So anyone who just subscribes there, you get in, and it'll be hosted on my website. Look for that this spring. That'll be out. And it looks like we have no other questions, so I'm going to say good night, and I appreciate all of you. And let me know in the comments, what kind of things would you like to see in the future? More stuff on world building? Are there particular topics you'd like to spend a whole hour talking about? we can do another just open-ended one. I can focus on something like maybe we do a whole section on religion, or we look at political systems or economic systems, and because there's a lot more out there than just capitalism and communism and socialism, guys. There's a lot more. So if you have a particular world building subject that you'd really like, let me know. Chime in. Shoot me an email if you want. I'm always available to talk. Find me on social media. I'm on Instagram at Laridian's Lab. I'm on TikTok, but less so. TikTok's not my favorite platform, but I'm on there occasionally. Instagram, Facebook, those places are easy to find me. And again, Substack and my website. I will see you all sometime soon. Thanks again.